Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Belonging series. And you know what? I am so excited about the presentation or the discussion that we're going to have today. This week, we've got Mervyn Weir and Marge Malcolm, and together they have responded in a powerful way to the events of almost 6 months ago with the death of George Floyd. And they have put together what they've called the I Can't Breathe project. It's a powerful project. I'm going to just read a little statement to start off with, and then we're going to invite them to give a little bit about their experiences. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Those were the final words of George Perry Floyd Jr., a 46-year-old man who on the 25th of May 2020 was brutally murdered by a white Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin. Whilst 3 of his colleagues watched on, not one of the 4 showed any regard or humanity for the safety and life of a man laying prostrate and restrained before them. George Floyd was a black man standing 6'7" tall, a father, a brother, a son, who would have been celebrating his 47th birthday on the 14th of October. But the video footage which captured the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life and its subsequent widespread distribution via social media of this brutal act formed a narrative that highlights the continuing fear-induced reality of being black in a white-dominated world. The actions depicted by these real-life events ignited the unconscious thoughts of Mervyn Weir to voice a historic narrative of the often brutalizing encounter between black and white, a narrative often denied or deliberately forgotten in an attempt to keep black people in suppression and oppression. The poem and illustrative book represents a historic educational tool to provide this and future generations with an intertwining and full description of the continuing conflict between the black and white. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just flick over and we're going to watch a short extract, just about a minute, of the I Can't Breathe project. Please tell me if you can hear this. Just want to make sure.
Cop with cold contempt for the noble institution of law and order that trusted him to be judge and jury and executioner too. No need for CSI. This crime scene has been seen on every screen the world over. No more undercover cop. This was the hardest diehards to watch.
I can't breathe. The toxic virus engulfs the globe, and no vaccine can save us from its vicious grip. Some say it's a new strain, but it's already claimed millions of lives throughout history. Those most likely to die all have an underlying chronic disease. It's called melanin.
High doses will leave you particularly vulnerable. Black on black, we reject. But blue on black, as we all have read, leaves the brothers dead, unable to breathe. The results have been devastating. On a global scale, people are dying on the streets of this race hate pandemic.
I'm going to just stop sharing there, and I would like to just welcome Marge and Mervyn, who have put together such a wonderful poem and production. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. You know, every time I see that video, I'm touched. I'm going to start with Mervyn, and then I'm going to bring Marge in. Mervyn, tell me about how this came about. What was it? What was the motivation? What brought you to this position as such?
You know, I have a background in the arts, both the visual arts and the performance arts. In the performance arts, I'm a playwright, and I'm looking for a subject.
Mm-hmm.
I might be interested in something and it speaks to me and I want to write about it. I might do some research. I didn't plan to write this. This reached out to me, and this was just, to begin with, just a personal expression of rage and being incensed at seeing something that we all saw.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose what came to me, it was this twin ideas of, this is unique and terrible, and yet it's not unique. It's been happening, you know, hundreds and hundreds of times over and over for many, many years, even centuries.
Mm-hmm.
But it was filmed and captured in a way that we couldn't refute it. We all saw it at the same time, at the same place almost.
Yeah.
We were onlookers.
Yeah.
And in that regard, you know, I couldn't help but be moved.
Mm-hmm.
And everything inside of me said, the only way to process this as an artist is to write it.
Yeah. And
this started almost like a stream of consciousness. I wasn't thinking about form. I wasn't thinking of editing or what it might end up being. It just had to come out. And once it came out, I shared it with a few people, including Marge, of course. And, you know, when people heard it, they felt that it had to be shared.
I know I don't know if I was one of the first, but when I heard it, I just thought, wow, that's just an outpouring of consciousness. Yeah. And it was very powerful. Did you, when you were I know you didn't set out to write it, but for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to see the full video, which goes, it's not just a video, it's not just a poem, it's more than that. It encapsulates so much. So if you haven't had an opportunity, I'm going to do the promo. Go and watch it, right? Go and watch it, please do. Because I was touched by it, and every time I hear it, I'm touched by it. But I'm still trying to work out what it is that causes me to be touched by it each time I hear it. There was something about it, right? And in the way that you've written it, that just draws the listener in. And it may be because it's part of my reality as well. So where did that come from in you?
Wayne, I believe it taps into something that all Black people and people of color know and experience in their spirit and through their experience. They may not have the sort of wide historical knowledge to say, oh, you know, to put it together in the way that I've put it, but they know from their own experience that this taps into something that connects all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a feeling of injustice, and it is a feeling that this isn't new,
mm-hmm.
that this is something that I've experienced. And I don't know if anyone saw that, I think it was a Channel 4 documentary that came out during this period. And there was the actor who had spent some time, I think in St. Lucia or one of the Caribbean islands, and he's on his way back to Britain, and he's had a really good time, you know, nothing in his mind in particular, but he's on his way back to Britain, and he starts to weep uncontrollably. And his wife is, what, you know, what's wrong? Why is he? what's wrong? She, you know, no one, he can't understand.
Yeah.
And he begins to unpick it. And what he's realized that in being in St. Lucia, where he was in a black environment, where he, you know, he stayed in a black hotel with a black manager and everybody around him was black.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't think anything about it consciously at the time. But all of a sudden, in returning to Britain, he's on his way back to the airport, he's coming back to the UK, and all of a sudden he feels burdened. And he's burdened with the fact that just to get through a day, there's a certain amount of conflict that he's going to face. There's a certain amount of not being himself, putting on a mask, you know, a weight on his shoulders that he's not always conscious of, but it's always there. And he realized that he was in paradise, as it were, for a few weeks. And now he's going to face, you know, that burden again. And I think anyone who's lived in a Western society as a black person will have occasions, and sometimes many occasions, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect. Sometimes you can speak to it and sometimes you can't, but you know that you are just having to get through another day, and you are facing sometimes very intangible forces that nonetheless seek to keep you down, keep you repressed, keep you from being who you truly are.
I understand.
And that's, I think that's what my work taps into. It's that feeling.
Yeah. So it's so, I think I agree. It's that, it's something which is recognizable, even though we may not consciously, we don't recognize it. But when the poem starts to unfold, it brings back to our consciousness so much things which have been subconsciously suppressed and repressed, because if we had to face it all the time, we would probably go mad. We would all be weeping uncontrollably. Yeah.
One of the things the poem taps into is some of the heroes of history that we've had to champion. And these are the people who've come into the, you know, into the Caribbean, come into Africa, you know, and enslaved us, repressed us, controlled, you know, so much about our environment and our potential. And yet we've had to champion them when they've been delivered to us in education as if they're champions.
Yeah.
And as the people who should be applauded. And what we've seen with Black Lives Matter is the, you know, the taking down of some of these monuments and the questioning of some of these people, should they really be positioned as, you know, worthy champions, worthy of honor. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. But so we've got to this, we've got a stage of understanding how the poem, some of the inner thoughts which help to guide the birth of the poem, the production, the creation of the poem. But there's one thing to go from having this good idea or having this poem, but to go from where you went from to then go to this production, you know. Marge, can you, I don't know, how did we get there? What's that journey? Tell me the journey of this poem. Is it time to bring Marge in, or how does it go? What's the
I'll start, and then Mervyn could always pick up where he thinks I've got it wrong. It's interesting that, because as Mervyn said, he just had to write, and that is how he operates. Okay, having known him for a long time, that's how he operates. And he writes, I say, in fact, he vomits it out, because when it becomes too big, it just flows and so on. And then the next thing I hear is, I've written something. and the next thing is, well, read it then. But how it comes from that into the form of having a production, having a piece of film, and then from that, for it now being spread to various parts of the world where we've had a number of people seeing it and making comments. It's really that you do it and it's powerful. But it didn't take long after he'd read it to me out loud, I'd read it myself, and it wasn't even finished yet, that it was a very clear thought that this is more than just something that should be on paper on digital format, or however we write it, it's got to be performed.
Yeah.
And so it just seemed to come very naturally. And just as how when he shared the poem with a number of people, they were moved by it. It was a very quick thing that a couple of individuals, one in particular is on this platform today, who actually, as soon as they saw it, said exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but by then we had already sat down, made a long list of who we thought should take part in the production, because it just seemed to be a natural progression.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also linked to the fact that a lot of what Mervyn does will be on stage, will be turning some of his stage production into films. So there is that natural journey, but there is something about this that felt that it had to be spoken.
Mm-hmm.
And an interesting aside on top of that is that, you know, when you've read the whole poem, and the film that we've made is actually not the total poem, it's just, it's a shortened version. But when you read the whole thing and it picks up certain pointers, there are bits in it where the performers chose to read that bit because it spoke to them so strongly. The guy who speaks about the conquistadors, no, not the conquistadors, who spoke about the Mayans and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, Mervyn, correct me if I'm incorrect, he actually is descended from that group of people.
Right.
So when he read it, he was in there, he needed to speak that bit. And I think that's also why the poem is powerful. As was said already, you read it and it says the things you really wish you were eloquent enough to say yourself.
Yes.
And it says a lot of things you want to say, in much as it's a long piece of narrative poetry, in a very short written piece. Mm-hmm. And you think, that's exactly what I wanted to say. Mm-hmm. But I just didn't, you know, I couldn't find those.
Yeah. And I like that points which you bring out, because within the poem, it's almost a historical narrative. It is a historical narrative. It brings together so many things. And there's a repeating phrase, which it's not hard to see a pattern here, a pattern so often repeated. It's the refrain, because it tells a story behind it. So, Merv, I'm just coming back to you again. Where did that, what was it? Because you do it the first time, and then you think, what was it about that phrase? Because it's repeated so many times. What was it? Why did you use that particular phrase?
Well, believe it or not, it's very simple, because that's the phrase that occurred to me as I reflected on our history over the last 400-500 years. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, when you look at the different incidences of Western colonial expansion, mm-hmm. and you look at them as individual stories, mm-hmm. you know, Captain Cook to Australia, you know, Cecil Rhodes to South Africa, Columbus to, you know, to the Caribbean, yeah. And the conquistadors. When you look at them as individual histories and stories, they can seem discrete, mm-hmm. and we get wrapped up in the details of each of those histories. But when you put them together, you can see that there's something common. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a pattern there, and there's a pattern about that colonial project where Western imperial, you know, forces go to different parts of the world, but with an eye, not for discovery, you know, in terms of invention, and isn't this interesting, this is a new place, mm-hmm. but primarily for exploitation. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, you know, under Columbus, it was very clear, mm-hmm. the agenda in terms of, you know, first of all, yes, finding a new way to the east. That was his primary project at the time. But whenever we look at the whole agenda, it was gold, and God is often part of the project, giving a Western form of religion, and glory, personal glory, mm-hmm. Was always part of the agenda as well. Mm-hmm. And every time you see that history, that expansion, those three things are always part of the agenda: God, glory, gold, or, you know,
Wealth.
wealth.
Yeah. Taking resources which doesn't necessarily doesn't belong to them.
Yeah.
I just loved, as I said, I really loved the way the poem, the cadence of the poem, the way it brings something new with each verse. There's something which you've explored in a different way. But going from just the poem, I know that your background is in productions and being a playwright and etc. But I also know that having spoken with you, that the plan isn't just for it to be a production in terms of a nice video and a book to go with. You've got a long-term objective. So can you explain a little bit about that and how you hope that will be impactful?
You know, both Marge and I have a background in education. We've both spent time as teachers, and I spent a significant amount of time in developing teaching resources.
Mm-hmm.
So education is always high on my agenda. Even when I'm writing a production, a play,
mm-hmm.
I'm always interested in knowledge and sharing that knowledge and just finding the right format in order to do that. So, and that's where the arts are so powerful, because you can share knowledge in a way which is so much more accessible and which can also reach the emotional centers that we can't always do if you take a straight teaching lesson, for instance. So this is a powerful medium. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk recently about decolonizing the curriculum. And it's like, all of a sudden, people have realized, although we've been working at this for the last 30 years at least or so, or longer, that what children learn in schools is powerful in
mm-hmm.
terms of the way that it forms their worldview of who they are
mm-hmm.
and where they fit into the world. And the academic Stuart Hall coined this term structured absence to talk about the fact that Black people and Black children in particular just didn't see themselves in the curriculum and in the classroom. And the fact that they were absent wasn't a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it was a structured absence. It was a deliberate keeping back of Black people's history. And the thing is, you cannot have an authentic telling of British history without including Black history.
Yeah.
You know, we've been here at least since Roman times,
yeah.
and have been part of the development of British culture for all of those years. And certainly since the Windrush generation, that has been an explosion of Black, Caribbean, and African involvement in the British identity.
Mm-hmm.
And no one in the world today could think of Britain without thinking of its Black composition.
Yeah.
You know, it'd be impossible to think of modern Britain. And yet, you know, our children going to school will often have no idea. And it's important also for the, you know, British, white, indigenous children to have this knowledge, as well as for the Black children to have it as well.
Yeah.
And as long as we keep sending children into the world without that knowledge, we are setting up future generations to perpetuate the same violence that this system of power has perpetuated for such a long time.
Yeah, I love that. I totally agree. And that term structural absence, it's I'm going to say it's not hard to see a pattern here, is it? Because a pattern so often repeated. And that's the thing. It's Stuart Hall, Bernard Cord. We've got so many great Black literary intelligence who have spotted this, not yesterday, not kind of like 10 years ago. We're talking 40, 50, 60 years, right? Windrush was 70 years, and it was even before Windrush that these things were spotted. So I suppose the question that I'm looking for is, what is the change that we want to see, and what is the change that you hope that you would like this project to inspire? I know it's a big question and I've just thrown it at you, but between you, where are we going with this?
You know, I spent some of my early years in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a very, even though a childish and, perception of what the Caribbean was and what it meant. And I remember the first time I heard in school about the Caribbean, I couldn't believe it was the same place. And right there, a seed was planted in my spirit that wanted to challenge that. Of course, I didn't have the knowledge or the words then. I was in primary school. Mm-hmm. But I remember feeling embarrassed, about that depiction of Black people and the Caribbean. When I finished my training as a designer, it's like this same problem had now become so exacerbated that it was on the national agenda. And there were reports done by, bodies like Rampton Report, the Swan Report, all talking about these issues and saying that we needed new resources and we needed Black, role models and teachers and so on. So I then, got into wanting to make a difference. And by that time I had a bit of knowledge and a bit more experience. And I got a wonderful opportunity working for an organization called ASA, Afro-Caribbean Educational Resources, which was spearheaded by Len Garrison. And some people might know of his work. He was also the primary moving force behind the Black Cultural Archives. And, and we had this opportunity to create resources with the Black child at the center, but not exclusively. It had to be an inclusive agenda of including all children, but certainly not missing out the Black child. And so they could see themselves, and these resources were phenomenal, had tremendous impact all over the country at the time. But look, all of these years later, we're still reading and hearing about the underperformance of Black children in school.
Yeah.
Bernard Cord's book was written in the 70s.
1971.
Yeah. And that, so at one level, superficially, we can see there's been loads of changes, loads of positive changes, and yet we are still underrepresented at the highest levels of civil society, of professional, all kinds of professional areas, and overrepresented still in prisons, in the justice system, in mental institutions. So when you deconstruct it, you kind of say, what has really changed?
Yeah.
And, education is the key thing that can make a difference. And so I really believe that, making resources that can be impactful for children, because, we get our ideas of who we are and identity can get fixed very early. And therefore, making an impact in the classroom, I believe, is vital. Yeah. And anything that we can do to help promote that, that's what I'm interested in doing. And that's why we believe this poem, so we are working with Romelda Williams, who is an educationist who used to also work at ASA, to create a learning pack to go along with this poem that can be used by teachers linked to the national curriculum.
Brilliant. I want that to be a reality. I think it should be in every school, because I believe that it's set in such a way that you're not actually giving any answers, but you're just signposting people to go. And it was Black History Month, and this poem kind of like encapsulates Black history. It's a signposter. It says, go and look at this person. And there's a couple of sections in the poem where you do lists of names. So you've done a list of American names, people who have died in the hands of the police, but you also do a list of the British counterparts as well. So you're actually showing, you know, that, and it's almost encouraging, not almost, it is encouraging people, go and know your history. Yeah. If you don't know it, if you don't know whose name this is, if you don't know the story behind that name, go and investigate it. And I just think that that's such a powerful thing, right? I'm just wary. I can't believe it.
I should say, in the final production of the book,
yeah,
apart from the well-known names,
yeah,
that people hear over and over again, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor,
yeah,
Tamir Rice, etc., we've made a list of American names and British names, a much longer list.
right.
Many names that you would never have heard of.
Right.
But each of those names represents someone who's died in the most unjust circumstances. And that person is somebody's son, someone's brother, someone's dad. And for them, that name is tremendously important. Even though it may not be the well-known names that we keep hearing over and over. Each one represents a story of unremitting grief, of people's lives who are permanently changed. Grief that will never be truly, gotten over, because that person is permanently missing in those families' lives. And we try to pay tribute to those unknown names as well, even though, they won't be recognizable by many people.
Yeah, that's brilliant. You know what? I always like to open things up to the audience, to those who are listening. And William, I'm going to pull William in because he's got a question which I wish I had thought of it. So William, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah. Okay, Wayne. Yeah, because normally, isn't it? That's what I wanted to get at. Normally, in the Belonging series, we get the background of the people.
Yeah.
But I suppose because the poem has been so powerful, I haven't had a chance to really ask you about your background. So really, I suppose, is wanted to know, I suppose, who are the people? Your Krak Productions. Who are you in that sense? What brought you to this place? I suppose, what key elements of your life experience, if you like, whether that's in Britain or abroad, has kind of brought you to the place where you felt that you had to speak out in such a powerful manner?
Okay, I'll start, and then I think it's important to bring Marge in, because whenever you see the credits at the end of a film or a play, you'll recognize that there's loads of names. Sometimes you think, how many people contributed to this? Sometimes something was very simple, but you'll see an enormous list of names, because it takes a team to make these things happen. And even though we do a lot of the different discrete jobs ourselves, it still takes a team. And sometimes people don't understand who a producer is. Sometimes you see the director and people got quite a clear idea who the director is. But the producer is very important. And Marge is a producer. Marge is a midwife. Marge gives birth to projects and productions, So I might be the creative force behind it, but that's creating something. But in order to share it with the world, you need the midwife. And the midwife takes enormous responsibility in getting finance together, getting people together, getting venues together. And, and she can speak to that in a moment. But so we have a passion in both working with organizations and working with arts and culture. And so we've often spent time working in corporate situations, training and using the arts, though, as a way to interact with those audiences. But Krak is really dedicated to cultural productions, both visual exhibitions, publications, theatre, etc. And we just take our background knowledge, as we happen to be Caribbean background, but that's given us a particular viewpoint. And we take our knowledge of both that culture, which has been important in forming who we are, but our experience in Britain and navigating that system, both as individuals and as professionals, to try and create interventions and resources that would be helpful, especially for the next generation who have to navigate the same system, and we want to share the benefit, as it were, of our insight and experience, and hope it will be of value.
Okay, I'll say something now, not as a midwife, just as myself for now. I've been called many things, Mervyn. Thanks for that addition. A little bit about the background, and as Mervyn said, he said a while ago, we both come from an educational background. I was born in the Caribbean, and I call myself one of the left behind children. And that's one of those who the parents come to the motherland in order to do good, to make it so they can bring the children over. But that was great. It was good being left behind, because I think I learned an awful lot. But certainly when I think about what has helped to bring me where I am, it's that journey of being left behind, having to come and learn something about how to fit into a new culture. I remember I can laugh about it now. It was irritating at the time, but the pains my parents went through to teach us slang when we came to England, so that when we went to school, we weren't looking too stupid, and that people wouldn't, think that, as if they wouldn't realize we'd just arrived, as it were. And the trouble they went through to learn those things, and all these other things. So you have that going on. I remember the career things at school, that all that you were pushed into was either being a teller in a bank or going into nursing. Nothing's wrong with those professions, but nobody wanted to talk about anything else. I remember going for an interview at a place, William, you're questioning, oh dear, I better not say too many things, but not too far from where your present abode from a workplace could be. And one of the professors there being very kind and saying, I'm so sorry, you can't possibly do this undergraduate course because you're working class and you will not understand the concepts that are being discussed on that. I remember all of those things. So what has brought us here? Oh, I do also remember that a lot of my work now, it's interesting, we're talking about this poem, and even when we talk about it educationally, we've already started to talk about it almost for children, almost in schools. But do you know what this poem has also done already? Is that it has allowed us to facilitate conversations. And maybe to our shame, we've had very few children in the conversation, or the younger age range, but it allows us to facilitate conversations that everybody needs to have. And by that, I do a little bit of work with some higher education institution, looking at admissions, looking at how we make decisions, looking at how we deal with people of different cultural backgrounds, and how we get them to, and how we explore where they're coming from without loading it with our own context, with our own culture, without just looking to see if they replicate who we are without trying to see who they are. And I think this poem, this narrative opens the door even for those adults, all of us as adults, to stop and actually see things from another perspective and recognize those who are in power, those who are not minorities and they're in power, and recognize that the history is there. We have a history. We have a lot to give. So step back for a moment and rest in the knowledge that when you are in a powerful position, you should be able to step back and listen so that you can hear where someone else is coming from, and understand that even the culture and the power you think you have, it doesn't belong to you only. It is because as a force, as human beings, as we navigate life together. So where does my background come into this? All of those things, but also my now ground, my foreground, my where I am now, helping to look at how we understand the history of those around us, how we impact on each other. And if this poem helps us to have a conversation that allows us to see, and even if at the very least, that, you know what, there's a lot of Black people who have talent and it's just there, and we don't have to make an excuse, and we don't have to ask permission, and we don't have to prove anything. Instead, let us just say, as humanity, there is a lot to learn from each other and to grow together and to give each other space. Because I frankly get quite fed up at times that there isn't enough space. So even at the most simplistic things, you have to fight to get in just to have an hearing. I don't know if that answers what you're asking, William.
Right.
I think,
Yeah, more than answer, more than answer.
there was, William, did you want to follow up with a question, or?
I'll let other people come in, yeah, because I
Okay, because, well, I'm gonna, is there any other question from the audience? Because I've got another one based on what I've just heard. Right. William, it's just me and you. Next week, right, it would be a double act, the William and Wayne show, yeah? Yeah, but I've just got one follow-up question, because it was something that both of you have mentioned, is that you were both born in the Caribbean and then you both migrated, or you both came to the UK. And I always like to understand that transition story, because I think also that transition story may well help us to understand part of how this poem came about. So as succinctly as you can put it, when you came across, what was your first impression of this wonderful homeland? Sorry, I don't know who wants to start.
I find it very difficult. I did find it really difficult. It wasn't wonderful at all, actually. I regretted it. I remember my sister and I, when we arrived, we cried for 3 months. And I think that when my mother said, if they cry one more week, she's sending us back. And we must have heard it because we stopped. But quite seriously, it felt, I think it was primarily the weather. We came in the summer, but primarily, and very soon when we went into school, we were mocked so badly. And I think the teachers didn't seem to know how to deal with that. We were mocked terribly. Children, you know, wanting to know what language we spoke, whether we had tails. It was just all the awful things that you hear, and you think that someone sat down and wrote it down in a book. You know, those sorts of things. You know, I got into even terrible physical fights at school simply because it just got too much. It was just a real hard time. So it wasn't a great, but then it's amazing. It doesn't take too long where suddenly you just think that you're here and you forget, and you get used to drinking squash instead of fresh juice, and somehow you navigate it. So I'll give Mervyn a chance. I'm not going to make it too long. You said succinct. It was hard.
Yeah.
Amazing. Mervyn.
A couple of things occur to me. One was the huge emotional trauma. The left behind syndrome that Marge alludes to means that many of us are actually brought up by our grandparents. Mm-hmm. And I was so young, being delivered to my grandparents, that I had no knowledge of my parents. I didn't know who they were at all. I thought my grandparents were my parents. So you have the trauma of coming to meet your real parents. And the thing about grandparents is that they have more time for you, you know. Grandparents look at their grandchildren with a slightly different eye in terms of their, you know, capacity for forgiveness, for being, you know, more open, sometimes warmer, but certainly having more time for you. Mm-hmm. And then you come to Britain, where our West Indian parents now are having a hard time surviving in Britain. So you know, they have less emotional time and space for you. So it's you know, I can only speak for myself, but I know it's also many others experience the same. And so there is that trauma. But you know, you get used to it. You find a way of navigating life. But those childhood traumas do have lifelong impacts on your relationships. I have to say that. But the thing that astounds me and that upset me when I was you know, in primary school, when I first heard about the Caribbean, is that the Caribbean is one of the most diverse places in the world. You know, you've got the Spanish Caribbean, you've got the French Caribbean, you've got the Dutch Caribbean, you've got the British Caribbean. I mean, you've got all of those languages and all those cultures that contribute to that region. And yet most people, perception of the Caribbean is a sandy beach in Jamaica. And of course, when people even look at me, they have no idea that I come from the Caribbean. They can't believe that, you know, that's my background. And there's another level of ignorance about the peoples that make up the Caribbean. So my wanting to share knowledge of the region is to, you know, it's almost to help me, you know, it's about my place in the world as well. And for people, you know, to recognize that. And people not understand about African enslavement, but don't understand what came hard on its heels once the British were forced to liberate the slaves, was a lot, you know, like 500,000 people from the Indian subcontinent coming to take their places under indentureship, which is a whole other history that we know very little about. So, you know, in my physical self, I represent all of those people who came to the Caribbean, the Africans, the Asians, and also the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were preeminent in the Caribbean discovery, as we like to put it.
Fantastic.
And I think, in fact, what Mervyn is saying there, he's actually saying in his physical self. Yeah, it is, you know, that mixture. Whereas for myself, it's primarily the African and the Asian, and it's the, you know, Indian subcontinent.
I totally understand that. I totally understand that concept. That's a whole other concept about the left behind and the trauma that has engendered in a whole host of people, and the impact it's had on them. I'm going to just bring Sunday in, and Sunday, you are going to be our final question, right? So keep it succinct, my friend. Sunday.
Thank you very much, Marge and Mervyn. This is amazing. You've taken me through quite a lot of very interesting conversations that you've shared with us today. I want to have one question for each one of you. It's basically based on what you just said. I was watching the question time a couple of weeks ago when one of the MP was arguing that we shouldn't be teaching Black history, the Black MP. And from what Mervyn just said, that this is a structural absence. I mean, in other words, it's planned that it shouldn't be there, you know. So that's my question to you. And then to Merge, you said something very, very critical, something that I've been working against for many, many, many years, where a professor, a teacher, or even the parent will say to a student, no, don't apply to that. You won't be able to get in there. You're not in that group at all. You know, it's for elite. It's for social class. Don't even dream of it. Yeah, and this is what myself and majority of us at Imperial as one have been working against for so many years. So my question to both of you on those two topics, what can we do to eradicate, to prevent such behavior from human beings that we live with all the time? This racial inequality, what can you suggest? Because people have been coming to us now, asking us for ideas, solutions, how we could prevent and eradicate these things. So I want to ask you for your opinion.
I think the biggest thing that we can do is definitely look at education, because that's where ideas are formed very early, and those ideas are often perpetuated. And, you know, children aren't born racist. So if we can do something before those opinions have been formed and are then difficult to deconstruct, that's the time to do it. So I think anything that we can do in that regard is really, really important. We know we can't change people's hearts. You know, you can't, you know, if people have hatred in their hearts, you can't magic, you know, you can't throw a wand or something and all of a sudden they're not like that. And that's why it's important to work at legislation, because at least you can put things in law to say, you know, this is acceptable and this isn't acceptable. And if you cross this line, there are consequences. So it's important to attack the legal system as well. But even when you put that in place, we can see that if the heart isn't right, people will try and work around it, you know, and do all kinds of things to make it of no value. But at least it's there as a sort of protection. But I believe we've got to work from a much earlier. The real power of the colonial project all over the world, to me, its success has depended very much on divide and conquer. And if we can do anything about that, that's what will lessen that power. The more we can come together and support each other and work together as a community and not be dependent on, you know, let's say a Western form of, almost, you know, when we look at the enslavement of Africans, it was later positioned as if the British were responsible for liberation. So they even control that narrative. And then there's that kind of white savior idea that we have, that we have to even be thankful, you know, to them for liberation. And all the heroes of Black liberation are almost omitted from history. You know, the continual fight from the beginning for freedom is absent from most people's understanding of history. So I think we have an obligation and a responsibility to support one another and work together and in that way we can be a lot stronger and not allow the system to separate us into different factions. So, you know, and we know what it's like, you know, Africans and Caribbeans, you know, and then we've got colorism, you know, and another way of separating us. Yeah. So we've got to look through all of that and come together, but also look at the educational system and make sure all our children are not being educated by a white supremacist version of history.
Yeah, fantastic. Marge?
And picking up from that, some of the things directly is, I'd say in terms of what to do, it's always hard to find a one answer. And I think that's why you're asking that question, Sunday. And I think from what you're saying, what you're doing, probably the work Wayne's doing, certainly the work I am doing, apart from my Krak work, the other work I'm doing in organizations and with academics. And I'd say it's to actually work very hard at educating the educators. You know, there's a lot of things that has to happen on many fronts. I'm hopeful because I see that the younger generation are far more open, and they're actually at this time clamoring for more information and more education so that they can make up their own minds about things. But I do think we have to work on several fronts. One is to educate the educators, allow them to see and to have access. You know, sometimes I get quite frustrated because I think that how come when you're wrong in me, you then ask me to give you the answer? I'm not talking about you saying that, Sunday. And I get, let me just put it straight, I get well vexed and so on. But I do think that they ever so often have to stop and realize that when you have been institutionally, culturally, and everything else raised in a certain way, you probably don't even see it anymore. So maybe I have to be more respectful when you don't know the answer, because you just don't see it for so long. You know, I don't like that idea in my head, but possibly there might be some room for that. So I think it's about, you know, the work like what Wayne's doing and what other people are doing is constantly pressing to open doors, to educate the educators, to let them see the wider picture, because for far too long, the doors haven't been open simply because they never ever thought of opening it. It didn't suit anybody's purpose. Things were hunky-dory, it was going on okay, so why change it? So there's that. I've talked about the younger generation. I think we have to also press on many fronts. So every front, you know, where you can support in order to actually bring a greater understanding, bring colleagues to the fore, allow them to have a platform, and don't follow the rhetoric. You know, there is something that I think we can do sometimes to ourselves. I hear all the time minority groups saying that the majority says to them or makes them feel they have to work 10 times harder. You know, and I think we've all heard that. And I sometimes think, for God's sake, look how long we've been doing this, working 10 times harder, how much longer? But I also think we have to recognize that, therefore, when we have the opportunity to allow colleagues to don't have to work 10 times harder, let them do it. What we sometimes do is beat up your own because you're so used to being beaten up. So when the slave master isn't beating you, you decide, oh my goodness, I'm going to show him how good I am. I'm going to beat you for myself. You know, and so on. So we have to put that behind us. And Mervyn said it. He said it very nicely. We have to work together. We have to come together, but we have to press on many fronts at the same time. So it becomes a wall of pressure, not just little bits of injection. And that's, so if you have power in the higher education system, you've got to use it, and you've got to make the best use of it. If you have it in the school, you have to use it. If you have it in your local community, you've got to use it. We cannot wait for somebody else to keep doing it. We've got to do it all together at the same time. And that way, I think we'll create a more critical mass of actually and pressure to put things to make change and so on. You know, we've got the widening participation agenda. Why people think that only Black people is for widening participation, but never mind, it's there, press it.
Yeah.
You know, and that's an example.
Guys, I knew I was going to have a good time this afternoon, right? And as I knew that Merv and Marge, the two of you, have been absolutely inspirational, right? And I'm just so thankful that you've come on to share your poem, but also to give us a little bit of an insight into what has motivated you to develop Krak, to develop the I Can't Breathe project. And I know that you're going to have many more projects, and we'll be here to support you and to promote you as best that we can, right? Because, and you know what, I would love to get both of you back on just as individuals to just talk more about your individual stories, because I just think there's, I thought, Marge, you were a bit of a fighter, but I didn't realize that you were doing it from in school too, anyhow. But I want to just say another really big thank you for coming on and for sharing your time with us this afternoon. So at this time, I'm just going to share our final screen. And then I know we're a little behind time, but next week we're going to have Valiant Lakshmani Krishna Jacob, and they work in a specific, specifically related to domestic abuse and intervention services and legal advocacy relating to trans and those individuals. So next week, please tune in, because we're going to have another very interesting discussion. And then also, if you missed any or you'd like to see this interview again, then please go to our Belonging Series YouTube page and you'll be able to see it. So all I've got to say is thank you once again for tuning in, and I hope to see you again next week. If anyone wants to stay on for the little after party, then please do. It won't be very long, but we'll have a little one at the same time. So thanks again for tuning in with us this week. Just